Welcome to the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies here at SAIS Johns Hopkins University. I'm Kent Calder, the interim dean of SAIS and also head of the Reischauer Center. And it gives me tremendous pleasure to have one of the foremost specialists on the political economy of U.S. Japan economic relations, and more broadly on the Japanese political economy here in Washington, D.C. Dr. Mireya Solis. Mireya, it's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mireya is director currently of the Center for East Asian Policy Studies and also the Knight Chair in Japanese Studies at the Brookings Institution right down the street. In fact, I can see the Brookings Institution out of my window here now. She's also serving as a senior fellow in the foreign policy program at Brookings. You may know Mireya from her work on the dilemmas of a trading nation, Japan and the United States in the evolving Asia-Pacific order. As I say, she's really one of the top specialists on the politics of trans-Pacific trade here in Washington. And that book looks inside the domestic systems of both Japan and the United States to show us the complex trade-offs that the two countries face in drafting trade policy that tries to reconcile some goals that are contradictory in some ways. They would seem to be between economic competitiveness, political legitimacy, and political visibility. Mireya is not only a think tank specialist at one of Washington's top think tanks, but also a scholar. She taught for several years at American University here in Washington and has a PhD as well as a master's in East Asian Studies from Harvard University, following her bachelorette in international relations at the Colegio de Mexico. So she looks at the U.S. Japan relationship, but from a broader North American perspective, comparative perspective. And I must say, I've been looking forward for a long time to hearing what she has today. Dr. Mireya Solis, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Kent. That's a very generous and warm introduction. I appreciate it. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you, even if virtually. And I want to talk today about the new directions in Japanese economic statecraft. And I would describe this as an adaptation to a world of hard-edged interdependence. And I'll go over what I mean when I say that as I go along. So let me just start by setting the scene and providing some overview of what I think is happening today in Japanese economic statecraft and why I consider this to be a moment of important transition. Over the last decade, Tokyo has become a very proactive actor, a very proactive player. Economic statecraft has kicked into high gear. And I think that a key objective for Tokyo has been to promote economic interdependence and regional connectivity to propel the Japanese economy, to acquire larger influence abroad. And when you look at this connectivity diplomacy, I think that the track record is in fact quite impressive. Japan has played a leading role in the making of not just one, but 3 mega trade agreements, something that when I was a graduate student, I would never have dreamed possible. Japan also has been very active in codifying rules for the digital economy, which we know plays a much larger role in economic activity today and in the future. And Japan, and this is building from past trajectory, but continuing forward, has orchestrated an infrastructure investment push in developing Asia. Moreover, under Prime Minister Abe, Japan rolled out very influential concepts for how diplomacy is carried out in the region. I'm talking about the blueprint for the regional order, the free and open Indo-Pacific, and also for cooperation among like-minded countries, the Quad. And these have continued to be points of reference and key areas of coordination for Japan, the United States, and the other partners. So I think that it's unmistakable that Japan's international profile has been elevated by this activism in Japanese economic diplomacy. And this was not the way in which we think in the past about Japan. So something profound has changed. But the world never stands still. And I think that there have been further developments. And this is what I want to now highlight. We are moving to a world system where the multilateral trading system has stagnated, the World Trade Organization, where we see the proliferation of protectionism, where we see growing rivalry, competition between the United States and China, and that is manifested in high-tech competition and restrictions. And I think that therefore this has encouraged Japan to recalibrate its foreign economic policy. And what I see today is Japanese policymakers very focused on developing a toolkit for managing the risks of economic integration. And we see now different initiatives. We see Japan, for example, now being tightening the screening of foreign direct investment to prevent the leakage of critical technology for national security purposes. We see discussions about tightening export controls. We see a lot of focus on increasing the resilience of supply chains. And therefore, one way to capture all this is to say that economic security has now risen, increased its profile within the Japanese toolkit, Japanese Economic Statecraft. And I think that has become very evident with the most recent developments. Japan has a brand new Prime Minister Kishida, and one of his first moves actually was to create a cabinet level position with a portfolio of economic security. So my talk today is really motivated by what I see as Japan's new balancing act, one that I think will have profound consequences for Japan's relations with China, for Japan's relations with the United States, and certainly for Japan's role at the regional level, at the global level. So what is this balancing act about? Well, I see two competing forces, and the challenge is how you reconcile them. On the one hand, Japan, I think, has been a strong champion of what I would refer to as economic internationalism. And what are the objectives here? Well, to promote interdependence, integration through rules that are accepted by others, where you basically agree that you're going to follow those disciplines, those standards, that if a dispute arises, you'll have a process to sort out that dispute that is based on the rules and it's not based on the exercise of market power. So that's one track of Japanese diplomacy that has been very, very important. Now, on the other hand, we see this rising field of economic security, which I would make the case is motivated by a very different rationale, because here the aim is resilience, risk reduction, and where states actually care very much about having a lot of discretion to restrict international economic transactions that they feel create vulnerabilities, and where market power becomes a very important consideration, where there is a strong push for the promotion of domestic manufacturing. So to oversimplify, I would like you to think about the tension between integration and international rules on the one hand, and autonomy and sovereign control in the other, and how we straddle these different worlds. And it's not just Japan. I think that almost every other state government is now confronted with this situation, a world of what I would refer to as harder-edged interdependence. So let me try to put a little bit more of flesh into the bones of what I have highlighted and give you more detail in these two phases of Japanese economic statecraft, as champion of connectivity, but also as a practitioner of defensive economic statecraft. And then I'll conclude my talk. So what do we think when we think about Japan's diplomacy when it comes to the promotion of economic connectivity? I think three main areas: the mega trade agreements, the infrastructure investment, and the digital economy. So I'll just say a word on each, just to give you a sense of how actually consequential Japan has become to the region and beyond on these areas. So let us think of Japan as a maker of mega trade agreements. Again, something that just a decade ago was something, or 15 years ago, that we were not thinking was doable. At the onset of the 21st century, Japan actually was very much at risk of being left behind because of its own domestic political constraints. It had yet to sign a preferential trade agreement, and every other government had rushed on that bandwagon, but Japan had not yet done that. Today, 20 years later, Japan has now 21 free trade agreements under its belt, which cover now close to 80% of its trade. So a lot has happened. And nevertheless, not all trade agreements are equal. Some are more important than others. And I think here it is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which has actually transformed Japan the most, redefined Japan. And that was a lot of the subject of my first book that Kent very kindly referred to. And even from the time I wrote that book till today, I would say that folks have been making the wrong predictions, the wrong bets about how Japan would influence and be influenced by the TPP. I know that we have a lot of students, so you are probably too young to remember this, but just a few years ago, when Japan actually joined the TPP in 2013, Japan was the last country to join in the regional TPP. And at that moment, there was actually a lot of reluctance to let Japan come in because many people felt that Japan would lower the standards, lower the ambition of the TPP, that it would drag its feet, that the negotiations perhaps would not come to a conclusion. And actually the opposite happened. Tokyo came very well prepared to the negotiations, speaking with one voice, with a high level of ambition. It certainly did not match the liberalization in agriculture that other countries did, but it offered enough not to become an unsurmountable obstacle, and certainly helped the United States with all the rules of the negotiation. So the more ambitious disciplines, Japan was working hand in hand with the United States. So that prediction did not pan out. The second prediction that did not pan out was that in 2017, when President Trump decided to walk out of the TPP, most people felt that the agreement was dead, that he could not recover from the exit of the largest economy in the trade grouping. And actually, Japan, against all odds, played very much the leadership role, and with the other 10 countries was able to rescue the TPP. Now, that was not an easy achievement. And it was very important for the TPP to remain true to its ambitions. So what countries decided to do was not to touch the tariffs, because they realized that if you begin to touch the tariff commitments, the whole exercise could unravel. But also they very, very carefully just suspended 22 provisions of the TPP on IP mostly that the Americans had championed were not popular with the rest of the membership. So you have a new, what we now call the CP, Comprehensive and Progressive TPP, that is very much the same as the original TPP. And this actually marked, I think, a high level of ambition for Japan. I would say that no one has looked at Japan the same way after it managed to rescue the CPTPP. And it did it because it wanted to protect a toolkit that promotes regional production chains, which are very important to Japan, because it wanted to avoid the void that was created by the American exit, so that there would only be China-centric integration initiatives, and because it was playing the long game, waiting out to see if the United States would ever manage to come back. And Japan's still waiting. And now we have now moved to the next episode, the next chapter into the CPTPP that probably you all have heard about, because now the game is called accessions. And countries, governments are beginning to knock on the door of the CPTPP. The UK is already negotiating terms of entry, but most significantly, I think in the past 10 days or so, we had China making the formal request, and then a day later, Taiwan making also a request. And again, this, I would say, signals that this is where the heart of the action is. And Japan and the other TPP countries now have to entertain these very consequential membership bids. My opinion, and we can get into this later in more detail in the discussion if you want, is that China is not ready to meet the standards of the CPTPP. This would require giving China a lot of exemptions. And what this means is that it's up to Japan and the other 10 countries now to decide whether they want to uphold those standards. The standards the United States cares tremendously about, but the United States does not have a direct say on this because the United States left the agreement. And just to conclude this section on the mega trade agreements, Japan has an agreement with the European Union, and Japan is also part of the largest trade grouping in the world that was just negotiated, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, where China is also a member, and the United States is not. So already you can see how much Japan is acting being proactive here. On infrastructure, because I know that time goes fast, let me just give you some tidbits on the important role that Japan has played in this area, infrastructure finance. We all, of course, have heard about the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a very important Chinese economic, foreign economic policy. But in fact, I would say that in Asia, this has been a two-horse race, and that it's not just China who's very active. Western countries, and certainly the United States, has raised a lot of concerns regarding the terms of the loans that China is offering, but Western countries are not keeping up, are not putting on the table the finance necessary for countries to have, in the region, have alternatives. Japan is. And, Japan traditionally, as part of its economic assistance philosophy, has always emphasized the importance of infrastructure. And when you look at the commitments from Western donors, the one country that stands out is Japan for its long-standing commitment to infrastructure. What has happened now that there is stronger competition with China, with the Belt and Road Initiative, is that Japan also coined its own label for what it was putting on the table. This is known as the Quality Infrastructure Initiative. And what Japan has done is to codify standards that would go towards giving that assistance in a more sustainable way to avoid creating debt traps, to avoid creating debt problems down the line. And for example, Japan talks about transparency of procurement, debt sustainability, fit with the overall development strategy of the recipient country. And just to give you a sense of how important this is, we always talk about Southeast Asia as being at the crux of the U.S.-China strategic competition. But when you think about infrastructure investment, really it's about China and Japan offering the most two countries in the region. There's a very interesting report by an economist, Roland Raja. This was published in the Brookings website, where, always with China, there's less transparency. So coming with numbers as to how much it's putting on infrastructure finance is tricky. But he estimates that between 2008 and 2016, China offered $42 billion to Southeast Asian countries in infrastructure finance, $42 billion. And Japan's offer was of $37 billion. So the gap is not very large. Compare that to the less than $2 billion from Australia and a little bit over $1 billion from the United States. And that gives you an order of magnitude as to who really is putting the money to build the infrastructure in the region. And the other track, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I do want to talk about the current economic security, is a digital economy. And the fact that Japan has been very active in trying to sustain an open digital ecosystem. And it has done this in two main ways. And again, this is just telegraphic because I want to get to other parts of my talk. But first of all, by making sure that CPTPP survived, that agreement has one of the most ambitious and comprehensive set of disciplines on the digital economy, which adopts the principle of freedom of data flows. We do privacy considerations, protections. And the other initiative from Japan is what is known as the data with trust. And this is something that Japan was very active when it chaired the G20. It has taken it to the G7, the OECD. And again, it's about setting standards so that you could have confidence that data, personal data, can be transferred in a safe manner. And this will require some degree of regulatory regime compatibility. And as you can imagine, it's a Herculean task. I'm not sure how much progress has been made, but certainly Japan is one of the active actors out there with interesting ideas in this field. So I would say that all what I described qualifies as a full-blown economic connectivity strategy. And this has done well by Japan. Its international profile has increased because of this. But now let's look at that other emerging side of Japanese economic statecraft, where I think of Japan more as a practitioner of defensive economic statecraft. I think that this development is a response to a much more challenging international environment. One that if I were to try to capture what I see happening, I would use the following phrase: the securitization, I know it's not very elegant, but the securitization of international economic relations. That is, security concerns and international economic transactions are becoming more integrated. And this changes how countries think about opening their economy, integrating with others. And what has brought this about? Many things, but I would highlight here three factors. One is, of course, great power competition between the United States and China, which means that now we have greater concern with the vulnerabilities that come from being interdependent with one another. And the fact that you are, of course, benefiting economically, but they're also now creating opportunities to use that as sources of leverage when you're trying to accomplish something. So that's one factor, state rivalry. The other one is, of course, the technological revolution that we are living today with these new emerging technologies on artificial intelligence, edge computing, the Internet of Things, 5G and beyond, and certainly the advances in semiconductor manufacturing. And this is important because these sometimes are referred to as platform technologies. In many ways, many of them are dual-use technologies, and they're going to be really foundational to economic competitiveness and military readiness. And therefore, a lot is at stake on who is at the forefront of developing these technologies. And lastly, the reason why we're meeting virtually, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that these accelerated these trends, and really, I think, showed us how much protectionism is now palpable. I think that we began to see export protectionism when it came to personal protective equipment, when it comes to vaccines. There have been now, we hear politicians all over the world talk about how we need to reshore manufacturing because we cannot be dependent on others. So I think that economic nationalism has flourished under the pandemic. So self-reliance has grown in appeal. It's now much more of part of the discourse of many governments. But I would say that we should not think that this is a desire for autarky, a desire for isolation, because this actually reduces national power. I think it's better to think about how some major players in the international system, what they're trying to do is to strengthen their domestic capabilities, but also make others more dependent on them by being at that cutting edge of the technological frontier. And obviously these trends impact Japan, and Japan influences them as well. Japan is an advanced tech democracy, a close ally of the United States, and it's located in a region with a deteriorating security environment. Among Japanese policymakers, I would say, there has been growing concerns with Chinese assertive behavior in the region, concerns about the leakage of critical technology, a desire to coordinate with the United States on these defensive measures, investment screening, export controls, supply chain resilience. So what I see today is Japan now boosting its defensive economic arsenal. And for example, in the spring of 2020, there were some important innovations. In Japan's National Security Secretariat, an economic security team was added for the first time. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry also added economic security teams. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, the Kishida government, one of the new innovations has been to create this portfolio for economic security. Now, we don't have yet the fully articulated strategy. This is on the making. And I think that what we're going to see now is actually a strong push for the full articulation of an economic security strategy. But already in some government policy documents, we see tidbits, indications of where Japan is going with this. And for example, in the growth strategy released a few months ago, there's a whole chapter on economic security. And the dual side of Japanese economic statecraft comes through. Because on the one hand, the document talks about Japan playing an indispensable role in codifying rules for free economic exchange and for Japan being a force for good in tackling transnational challenges like climate change, for example. But on the other hand, it also talks about a harsh international environment and therefore emphasizes resilience, the need to hedge against risk by diversifying supply chains, and to think about supply chains not just as efficiency oriented, but also in terms of resiliency oriented. This also aims to protect critical infrastructure and to avoid, and this is important, over-reliance on certain countries. So I think that Japan's economic security will be anchored on two concepts. A strategic, and these have been already elaborated in these policy documents, a strategic autonomy that is eliminating excessive dependencies, and a strategic indispensability, increasing the number of economic sectors where the international community relies on Japan. So it's a strategic autonomy and a strategic indispensability. So how will this be operationalized remains to be seen. But what I would like to do in my remaining minutes for this presentation is to focus on what I think some of the most concrete manifestations of this have to do with supply chains. In some ways, the global supply chain is really the most important phase of globalization, of this current phase of globalization. We're talking about really knitting together in a very profound way different national economies. What you do with a supply chain is that you fragment the different segments of the production, you operate across national boundaries, and you have tightly integrated production systems. And this has now become, of course, a major concern when you're thinking through the lens of economic security. So there are two important developments that I'll just very briefly touch upon, and then I'll welcome your comments and your questions. One is a Japanese initiative that has been labeled Strengthening Supply Chains. And this was launched last year in the spring of 2020. And this was mostly a response to the pandemic and the lockdowns in China and how that created disruptions in Japan. And therefore the government, the Abe government, Abe administration, launched this program, which entails subsidies to both bring some production back to Japan, but also diversify by shifting some production to Southeast Asia. So far, in the latest figures I looked at, 200 companies have received something like $3.1 billion in subsidies. Now, when you look at what sectors have been targeted with the subsidies, I think that that's revealing of what the objective is here, because obviously medical supplies, personal protection equipment, some of the companies producing this received subsidies, and they were mostly about bringing them back to Japan, but also some companies that operate in high-tech sectors, such as advanced materials like chemicals and rare earths, semiconductors, electronics, have also received these subsidies. Now, what I would like to dispel is the notion is that Japan is pursuing decoupling from China. The subsidies are small compared to the overall stock of investment from Japan in China. That's in the range of $130 billion. $3.1 billion is not going to really structurally change the situation. They should be seen as a hedge strategy, risk reduction strategy. This is part of efforts that Japan has taken in the past. For example, this is called the China Plus One strategy to mitigate overdependence on China. Companies that receive these subsidies do not have the obligation of leaving China. This is not an exit from China strategy. Again, it's about just making sure that when it comes to some specific sectors, that there is more diversification, and that the lockdowns and the pandemic and the U.S.-China rivalry will not impose costs on Japan. Now, the other important, and this is, I promise, my last point, the other important development on semiconductors has to do with the semiconductor supply chain. And this is a key arena. The United States is doing a lot here. It's very concerned about increasing its resilience, taming Chinese high-tech ambitions, and coordinating with allies. These are all things that the US government is pursuing today. Now, again, for the many students here who are young, you may not know this, but semiconductors have played a key role in US-Japan relations. In the 1980s, the predictions were that Japan actually would overtake the United States and dominate this industry. And that actually led to some of the most bitter disputes on trade between the two countries, and the famous or infamous, depending on your views, semiconductor agreement that had a heavy dose of managed trade and actually was later on found inconsistent with the WTO. But a lot has changed since. What has happened is the entry of competitors from Northeast Asia, particularly South Korea and Taiwan. US companies made a comeback, and especially when it comes to chip design, they're the most advanced. And Japanese companies actually failed to make an important technological leap and move towards logic chips. And this actually then rewrote the history of this sector so that Japan is no longer that dominating force overall, and its market share is only 10%. But semiconductors through and through have been a strategic sector, and now there is a different sort of tension in the system that also has implications for Japan and U.S. Japan relations, because semiconductors really are at the heart of U.S. China strategic competition. China has heavily subsidized this sector. China has ambitions for greater self-reliance on this sector, and the United States has been very concerned about the security risks that this represents, and certainly in dealing with the Chinese company Huawei and the fact that Huawei is leading the way on 5G deployment across the world. One way in which the United States found the key vulnerability to that was the fact that China does not yet produce the most advanced chips. And tech restrictions, what we refer to as the entity list, were imposed, whereby not only American companies, but any company that uses American technology and equipment needs a license to be able to sell to several Chinese tech companies. But that was not all that has transpired. The White House has also undertaken a supply chain resilience exercise. And I think that this, the report came out and it actually reflects, I think, two sides of the Biden administration thinking on this. Again, two contradictory, what I would call contradictory spirits, that the tension has not been solved. Because on the one hand, I think there's a heavy dose of unilateralism in the US approach. The White House Supply Chain Resilience Report talks about Buy America, talks about unilateral security tariffs, the 232 tariffs, and talks about a strike force to clamp down on unfair foreign trading practices. But on the other hand, it also talks about trying to cooperate with allies and building trust in supply networks. And this is where cooperation with allies like Japan is critical, because Japanese companies actually, while they do not dominate the semiconductor industry the way they did in the past, actually do have control over what we call, refer to these days as choke point technologies. That is, they have dominant presence in some segments, and therefore they're all important in these areas. In chemicals, for example, some Japanese companies represent 90%, 80% of the supply of these chemicals. And so the same is on some of the production equipment. So what I see now in this world of economic security is that industrial policy has made a comeback, and that it beckons now both the United States and Japan. Both governments are talking about boosting their domestic manufacturing capabilities. They're discussing subsidy packages, which have not been authorized yet, but nevertheless, they are in the drawing board. The United States talks about $50 billion as part of its CHIPS Act. And METI released a semiconductor strategy, the Ministry of Economy in Japan, just in June, where it talks about the need for $46 billion to help revitalize the industry. What is interesting in that METI semiconductor plan is that, of course, in Japan, there's a lot of concern with China's state capitalism, with protecting an industrial base, cooperating with the United States, as I said before. But when METI talks about the challenges for Japan's semiconductor industry, it also notes that many other countries in the West are also stepping up with providing subsidies to try to attract that investment. And there is concern that some of these choke point technologies where Japanese companies are so competitive may migrate to these other places where industrial hubs are being built. So concerned with a potential hollowing out of the Japanese industry. Where this will pan out or not, we don't, of course, we're not in a position to say, but just to highlight and this is my ending point, that we have now arrived to a new normal. Japan is now more willing to raise its shield, so to speak, vis-a-vis China, to prevent the leak of technologies, to enhance supply chain resilience. But this does not mean that coordination with allies is smooth and will not have its own challenges. There is tension between the use of collective versus unilateral approaches. How far are we talking about decoupling vis-a-vis China on one sectors, and going back to my last point, the specter of a subsidy race. So again, I think that we are now in new terrain, and making sure that you can walk on both arenas to best effect, I think, is Japan's enduring economic statecraft challenge. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Mireya. That is a very interesting presentation. I can see we already have a few questions, but let me ask just one that, having written a piece about Japan as a reactive state in foreign policy for World Politics some years ago, I think, as you know, it sounds as though what you're saying here is that Japan is a very, is really rather proactive, that there's a fundamental transformation in Japanese policy. As I look at some recent developments, certainly if we look at things like the Olympics and the way that Japan just sort of took the various diktats from the IOC and so on, and when Prime Minister Suga rushed off to Washington right at the beginning of his administration, it sort of looked as though maybe the reactive dimensions are still there. I wonder, how do you see this question of the reactive dimensions of Japanese policymaking? I mean, maybe we could say on, of course, the Indo-Pacific, Prime Minister Abe at a certain point in time did originate a lot, but then at the recent summit, the Quad Summit, many of those initiatives also looked like they were resonating with things that the Biden administration wanted. Is Japan still reactive?
Thank you, Kent. That's an excellent question. And of course, I know your article. I think it has been one of the most influential pieces.
Please answer as you wish. That wasn't a loaded question.
No, but clearly, that very much framed how we think about Japanese foreign policy. And I think that when it comes certainly to trade, I would make the case that there has been quite a significant transformation, and that it has to do enabling activism, enabling a more proactive role. And it has to do with changes at the domestic level, but also changes in the international environment that Japan was responding to. So in terms of what has happened that allowed Japan to be more purposive and deliberate, some things are the weakening, for example, of the agricultural lobby, the fact that there were electoral rules adopted in 1994 that started a gradual process. The organizational clout of JA also has become weaker. And I think that it became possible for Prime Minister Abe to actually, bring Japan into the TPP and not suffer a huge electoral penalty. He did this with care, because there were some red lines from the agricultural lobby that he did not cross. And that's why when I talked about the high level of ambition of the TPP, I noted that Japan was not on par with agricultural liberalization, because again, he had to respect these red lines. But the agricultural lobby had vetoed negotiations with any large-scale agricultural exporter. And in the TPP, you have the United States, you have Australia. So clearly things had changed. So that's one element. The other element is, of course, the centralization of power in the prime minister, the fact that the Kante, the prime minister's office, was able now to initiate policy, coordinate among ministries. And I think that this was particularly true during the Abe years. And one thing that Prime Minister Abe was able to do was to, and this comes from longevity, the fact that he stayed in power for so many years, that he was able to keep party discipline, and he was able to arbitrate the disputes among the ministries. So in trade, for example, frequently Japan would not be able to accomplish much because Japan was at war with itself. The economic ministry was battling the agricultural ministry at the negotiations with a foreign counterpart. And what was different with the TPP is that you had these headquarters that allowed the Japanese government to speak with one voice. So, and now Japan has created other bodies to allow for these more top-down decision-making, and certainly the creation of the National Security Secretariat is important in that respect. Now, that does not mean that Japan is not reactive in other fronts, and that Japan also, I think that has always very carefully plotted its initiatives, keeping in mind maintaining good relations with the United States. So for example, when Japan decided to relaunch the Trans-Pacific Partnership, actually, there were some quiet consultations with Washington to make sure that this would not create friction between the two countries. And I think that the Trump administration felt that nothing would come of it, that they had no interest in regional trade agreements, and therefore that they had no view whatsoever. I think that later on they came to resent it because there were some American producers that became disadvantaged, and then they came back and wanted Japan to negotiate what eventually became a bilateral agreement.
Thank you. I see that we have a question, and obviously he is so well versed on many of the issues. Professor Scheer and Ambassador Scheer, Dave, do you have some comments?
Thanks, Kent, and thanks, Mireya, for that terrific presentation. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the tension between internationalism and economic security. And I'm wondering if that tension plays out institutionally in Tokyo. Do different ministries line up in different places on the spectrum? And my second question is, have you seen any tensions between the US and Japan on the economic security side emerge yet? If so, what are they? What are the likely places?
Thank you, David. And that's a terrific question. I have not yet picked up on the institutional battles and whether some ministries are leading the front on economic security and others are resisting. I think that clearly METI and MOFA are actually both honing and strengthening their capability. They both opened new teams. I think what would be interesting now to keep an eye on is what happens with the new appointment of an economic security minister, and how, one of the measures, one of the intended objectives is to write a broad economic security law, because many of these will have implications on so many different fronts. So when that begins to affect the turf of different ministries, I think that's when the battles might come. So because this is still an emerging track, I don't think that we have yet seen different ministries fight for their specific jurisdiction. This is just beginning to percolate. But the fact that now the strategy is going to be put in place. And I would also point out that Akira Amari, who has been a leading voice in economic security, is now Secretary General of the LDP. So I think that we're going to see a much more sustained effort to come up with the legislation. And then it will be interesting to watch how the different ministries and other groups weigh in. On whether tensions, any disagreements or tensions on the economic security front between the United States and Japan, nothing that comes to mind other what I suggested in my talk, and I've heard this in several occasions, that they would like to get further reassurances from the Biden administration that they're not really thinking about full whole-scale onshoring of production, that they want to have a robust division of labor and the semiconductor industry between the United States and Japan. And therefore, this concern I mentioned in the METI document about hollowing out of some choke technologies is something that's in the mind of Japanese policymakers. So how you actually go about developing these trusted supply networks, what kind of mapping exercise will be undertaken, how you avoid a subsidy race between the allies. I think that these are all things that still need to be worked out, and there's a strong convergence of interest, but then when you actually go about operationalizing it, I think that's when it would be important to keep communication channels. My sense, David, is that if anything, probably where there's a little bit more of disconnect is on the connectivity agenda, so to speak, and the fact that the Biden administration has not really signaled strongly that it's ready to launch a digital trade negotiation, or that China is knocking on the door on CPTPP, and we don't seem to have much to say on that front. I think that's where some of the disquiet comes, that we're not ready to, because for this to work, you would like to have action on both fronts, and it still looks more lopsided. The US mostly taking on defensive economic measures, but not the trade negotiation side of things.
Thanks very much. Dave, do you have any follow-ups on that, or does that?
Oh, that pretty much covers the territory.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Mireya.
Thanks a lot. I might just mention, if you have questions, please do feel free to go to the hand-raising function, or if you don't have a way to do that, try to signal to us as people are thinking about their questions. I did have two from someone who did not have a hand-raising function. Mireya, if I could maybe read those. One of them is, can you elaborate on the economic ties and trade relations between Tokyo and Taipei, and how China is responding to those? Of course, semiconductors right at the heart of that. And then the second question is, you mentioned earlier that Japan has made some headways in data and privacy regulation. Could you please elaborate on those policies and if they mirror what is going on in Europe?
Thank you. Excellent questions. Let me take the Taiwan-Japan ties first. Clearly, there has been an increase in the intensity of the relationship, in the desire of Japanese policymakers to express their concern with what is happening with making sure that stability in the cross-strait stability is maintained, that China's assertive behavior and what we saw this weekend with the vessel intrusions in the air defense identification zone. So we see Japanese policymakers expressing more vocally those concerns. I also think that when it comes to economic security, Japan is also trying to lure the most efficient foundries. TSMC, for example, is their plans to open a research facility in Japan, and Japan would also like to eventually have a foundry built in the country. So there's strong complementarity there. There are, of course, always some tensions in every economic relationship, and one of them has had to do with the Fukushima food products and the restrictions, import restrictions in Taiwan out of food security concerns. But those are things that could eventually be worked out. And now with Taiwan's request to join the CPTPP, I think that you saw from several policymakers in Japan a warm welcome, an expression that Taiwan has made a lot of homework, and in terms of standards, it's pretty ready to consider the CPTPP disciplines. But of course, everybody understands the difficulties in the road ahead. And I think that was actually one of the motivations of China to move so quickly in requesting CPTPP membership. And China already objected when Taipei followed suit and also raised its hand. So, I don't think that neither China nor Taiwan are in for a quick admission into the CPTPP. I think that geopolitics has landed with strong force in the lap of the CPTPP members, and how they handle this is extremely important. I don't see the very much an opportunity to replicate the accession process that took place in the WTO, where there was an understanding that things would move in sequence, because China's positions have hardened. And but the CPTPP is open to separate custom territories, and it has origins in APEC, and it should be based on the ability of members to meet the standards. But we know that the geopolitics will always be a factor, and that the bar is high because you need consensus from all existing members who have ratified the agreement. And the other one, data and privacy regulation. I think that to provide some context, the digital economy continues its advance, and there's a clear lag in the codification of standards. And actually, we see a proliferation of digital protectionism. China is actually on the lead on this, but it's not the only country. And there are many different ways in which this protectionism manifests. One of them is, of course, the internet firewall, but also very strict data localization requirements, the asking foreign technology firms to surrender source code or encryption, and investment and market access restrictions. And, Japan and the United States and other countries have a strong interest in making sure that the potential of the digital economy is not hampered by this, that democratic standards are wedded into the way in which we think about the governance of data. And, but nevertheless, this presents a huge challenge, how you go from a strong alignment on interest to actually operationalizing this. And there have been different tracks. One is through free trade agreements, where, as I mentioned, the comprehensive progressive TPP has some of the stronger disciplines out there. The Japan-US digital agreement has these same provisions. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement does, but what we don't have yet is a plurilateral agreement that has Japan and the United States and other like-minded countries. So I cannot emphasize enough how much frustration there is among some of our closest allies in the region that we are not moving, and I'm talking about the United States, more proactively on this. It's not just a plurilateral digital trade agreement. There are other agreements. There's one that I think has a lot of potential. This is a digital economic partnership agreement negotiated by Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. And it has some binding rules on freedom of data flows, but some digital trade facilitation. South Korea just joined this week, and neither Japan nor the United States are there, but that's certainly one venue. There is another set of negotiations in WTO, e-commerce negotiations. Japan is a founding convener of those talks. But again, the national positions are very different, and China is not going to abide by binding rules on freedom of data flows. The Europeans have a very different approach to privacy regulations, and this has not yet come together. And I'll just stop by saying that there is the Data We Trust initiative, but that has more to do with regulatory compatibility. and the mutual recognition that sufficient protection is awarded to personal information, and that should enable data transfers to take place.
Well, thank you very much for those really comprehensive answers. I'm seeing we have a lot of interest in the chat. And so I would ask everyone simply to ask one question, because we really, we only have a little less than half an hour left. As our next questioner, Mr. Ueno, Hideki Ueno. Are you there, Ueno-san?
Yes, I'm Hideki.
Ueno-san. Yes, please.
Thank you for your comprehensive talk about the economic security. I have experience working as a visiting researcher at the think tank and the position office that established and accelerate this topic, Japan version National Economic Council. So I'd like to ask about more the indispensable topic. As you said, the major semiconductor manufacturers in Japan, in China are Japan, USA, and Australia. In addition, the most demanding choke point in China's chip supply chain is the Chinese market. What do you think Japan should value to build offensive economic security? And I'm curious about this choke point in China. If you have any good references, could you share them with us? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Those are really interesting questions. And I have to say that they're triggering a lot of reflection for me, as this is a new area of work. You know, there's a lot of discussion about whether Japan can only practice defensive defense and whether it has any hope of developing offensive defense toolkits. And I think that this actually comes a lot in the conversation on cybersecurity. And that's another area that just beginning to wet my toes, but it's also certainly very important to economic security and the digital economy. I think that, you know, Japan has for a long time been very reluctant to use offensive, defensive, and even just naming in cases of cyber attacks, naming the source of the attacks is something that the government was not prepared to do. I believe just a few days, there was actually an explicit naming of perpetrators of attacks. So I think that this is a moving target. And I would imagine that Japan will be doing more of this. But what Japan, well, and it depends from your vantage viewpoint, because you know, from the point of view of South Korea, they probably will feel that Japan has already, you know, used choke points in the decision to tighten export controls, which happened in 2019 at a time when relations were deteriorating. Tokyo and Seoul are never going to agree on what motivated those actions. They're part of a broader deterioration of relations, but what's interesting about the discussion about the offensive measures and the manipulation of choke points is that even if you have that capability, I would say, is not cost-free. That if you decide to call that card, there is a cost that comes to you. And I say this based on that episode, because following Japan's decision to tighten export controls on the chemicals and delist South Korea from the white list, what that triggered was a response from the South Korean government and business to try to reduce their dependence on Japanese companies. Once that vulnerability is exposed, there's going to be an adjustment. And Japanese companies that produce etching gas and other gases reported actually a loss of 30% of their sales in South Korea following those actions. So again, it's not, this new normal is extremely complicated, because even if you have the choke point capability, you have to realize that by invoking it, you are creating a disincentive for that counterpart to depend on you, and eventually that would leave you worse off economically and perhaps with fewer levers to push.
Mm-hmm. That is interesting. Perhaps the same logic might have applied to the response to the Nixon shocks when the U.S. embargoed soybean exports, and then Japan started importing from Brazil or diversifying its supplies. Very interesting. We have a question from Ben Self, a SAIS alum. Good to see you, Ben.
Thank you, Dean Calder, for hosting this wonderful event. Thanks to the Reischauer Center. And thanks to you, Mireya, for an absolutely wonderful and comprehensive presentation. I was inspired to follow up on Ambassador Scheer's question about balance and the sides being taken in Japan. And I'm actually interested in what hasn't come up very much, the private sector. Japanese large corporations are, and small and medium corporations are increasingly dependent on China. Not to the extent that South Korea is, but Japan's a #1 trade partner. And so the balance of maybe the government and people in the administration and the LDP leaning towards harder stances on economic security would imply a tougher line with China than even the Abe administration took with Nikai as Secretary General. But Kishida has talked about balance all his political career. He's emphasized the importance of balance. And he'd certainly have an ear open to the voices of major Japanese industry that are trade dependent with China. So I'm wondering whether you see the private sector being able to exert leverage over the trajectory of Japanese economic security policy and what they would hope for in terms of, providing them the security against risks in the China market, but also allowing them to continue to make the profits that they make on dealing with China. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And that's a great question. And, this new normal that I've been discussing, where security considerations now weigh more heavily on international economic relations, I think is by and large not welcome by a lot of the international business community. And I actually have a paper that came out earlier this year on Japanese supply chains, and the title is "The Big Squeeze." And I'm, trying to reflect how sometimes they feel under siege, because what this does is that it takes away certainty, predictability, clear rules of the road, and they feel that this is happening right and left. And there's some interesting, JETRO and there's a lot of JBIC. They do surveys of Japanese corporations, international corporations, and they talk about how much they feel the 301 tariffs, the China's retaliation, the concern that at some point the Trump administration would impose tariffs on just the threat on automobiles. It never came through, but the threat already affects your calculus as to how much you're going to invest or where or how this might affect you. Then comes the pandemic and, and the tech restrictions. So, they're not happy, but it doesn't mean that they are going to divest and that's the jerk reaction and that, just packing and leaving is easy to do. There is a very interesting survey that I mentioned in this paper where they ask, what is the most common adjustment response to the lockdowns, the pandemic, the strategic competition? Relocation is near the bottom. It's not the top. They're going to try to do many other things before they actually think about relocating. And certainly when the subsidies for the Japanese government subsidies to that strengthen supply chains were being rolled out, you have lots of Japanese companies saying, we're not leaving China. And China still has a very strong market and pool, and we're not going to leave that market. So I don't think that the subsidies were intended to do that. They were intended to give the option to those who felt that operating in China is becoming also complicated of its own accord, given the direction that the Chinese government is taking. And they also, that's taking away a lot of certainty. It's not just the friction with the United States, is that Chinese companies are also seeing the rules of the game in transition. So, I think that what we're going to see in Japan, again, there's no radical departures. And, Kishida, of course, talks about economic security, talks about concern with China's behavior, but talks about dialogue and making sure that the relationship is not damaged beyond repair. And I think that's another balancing act that we're going to see. And where the U.S. lands on this, just this week, USTR Catherine Tai gave a talk on U.S.-China policy, and now she's talking about recoupling and durable coexistence, I think. So again, these are because we stitched together the global economy for 70 years. Even though we're now afraid of what might we be doing to each other, there's a lot to be lost if we actually, pack and go home, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. We have Audrey Reinecke. Audrey? You muted, Audrey.
Sorry, I'm going to defer to Jonathan, since if I don't get to my question, I'll have an opportunity next week. So I'm going to let him go first. Thank you.
Jonathan Canfield, a Reischauer Fellow here. It's actually a former fellow and now a first-year MA at SAIS.
Hello, Dr. Solis. It's great to see you again, and thank you for a really fascinating presentation. I was going to ask a very similar question to the prior one about how Japanese companies are kind of being compelled to leave, but there's been a good amount of resistance, and they see it more economical to stay and hedge their bets. So I guess I was now wondering, how should we be thinking about kind of these organizations and informal groupings like the Quad with regards to supply chains? You talked about supply chains being a pretty massive global force. And even though each country has their own national interests, they're working together on some of these issues. So I guess what sort of influence and impact do you think like the Quad could have, and where do you really see perhaps the downfall over maybe whether it be competing visions or just the intricacies of trying to connect each other's supply chains together?
Thank you, Jonathan. Also a great question. I think that the Quad in its most recent incarnation has achieved or has great promise. It hasn't yet achieved something very concrete, but nevertheless, I think that it has really positioned itself in a way in which it is potentially a very effective platform for its members. And I think that it can be of more consequence to the region. And I think that it offers a smarter approach to have a constructive competition with China. And why I say this, because I think that what has happened is, first of all, that the leaders have now committed to have this summit. They're going to be meeting annually. So that means that there is a political will there, but also that the Quad in its latest incarnation really has positioned itself as a supplier of public goods for the region. And, the vaccine initiative, very important, but also the working group on climate, and related to the topic we've been discussing, the one on supply chain resilience and emerging technologies. So what we saw from the readout or the fact sheet from the meeting that just happened among the leaders, the meeting in person, is, for example, something that I think could be meaningful, and that is greater coordination on standard setting. So again, when you think about AI, when you think about mobile communication networks, 5G and beyond, I think what has happened is that we have not been proactive enough in making sure that we have a say in rulemaking. So if there is coordination among like-minded countries in the standards that go into these technologies and their commercialization, I think that is meaningful. I also think that this could lead, for example, to some exercises in a mapping of the supply chain. And many companies are not happy that they're being asked to provide this information. But nevertheless, if this is used to build redundancy, and if the notion is that, again, we're not thinking of manufacturing everything at home, that makes us actually very vulnerable to domestic shocks, when we're trying to create a resilience and redundancies through these networks, I think that could be very beneficial. However, we should not by any means think that the Quad solves everything. And I think that there's one risk that I see, and that is that we talk to the people that think like us, we work with the people that are like-minded, but the world is a much bigger place. And therefore, we need to make sure that we can devise economic initiatives that bring in the rest of the region, even if they do not match the high level of standards, if they're not the consolidated democracies that we're working with. Because, you know, otherwise we're leaving this wide open. And that's why when people talk about the tension between the Quad and ASEAN, I think that the fact that the Quad is now not emphasizing an antagonism towards China and certainly providing public goods, it's better, a smarter strategy. But nevertheless, we should not just rest at the Quad, and we should be thinking about how we integrate with the region writ large. And that was, maybe this is me being repetitive, but this is one of the benefits of the original TPP and certainly the existing CPTPP, that you have countries at very different levels of development thinking about economic opportunity together. And that's something that I think has not yet been fully realized with the current initiatives. And the Quad is very good, but we should also be thinking about the broader picture.
Thanks very much. I do see, I have one question more, Audrey. There are others I seem to remember early on who put up their signs. If there are any other last questions, you know, please raise your hand or indicate that you would like to speak. Audrey, briefly.
Okay, very quickly. Thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Solis. I read your article just the other week talking about the challenges that China will face in its bid to join the CPTPP, and then Taiwan, of course, as well. And my question is, sort of barring the long-term, you know, whether or not it will ultimately be admitted, what do you see as the short-term impacts of that move?
I think that, you know, this is a win for China. Regardless of, you know, what the long-term implications are, because by doing this, it already exposes again how hollow the narrative of decoupling is. They just have, you know, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. They're the ones that are now trying to join the CPTPP, and the United States is nowhere to be seen, is not in that neighborhood. So that's number one, immediate win. I think also there's an immediate win in complicating Taiwan's application, because it was long expected that, you know, Taiwan has been for quite a number of years now trying to get ready to be to match the standards of the CPTPP. And now that China is also making a formal bid, that also complicates things. I also feel that, you know, I think that China, if China eventually makes it into the CPTPP, again, it undermines the notion of decoupling. It gets the benefits of greater market access. But if it doesn't make it, nevertheless, it will be harder now for the CPTPP to grow, because there is a huge task, and that is what do we do with the Chinese and Taiwan membership bid? So, you know, if it makes it, great. If it doesn't make it, then, you know, this grouping will nevertheless be grappling with this for several years, and the United States, again, appears as absent.
Thanks very much. I see Jada Fraser, another Reischauer Fellow.
Hi, Dr. Solis. First of all, thank you so much for giving this presentation. It's been really very interesting. And kind of following off of Audrey's question related to CPTPP and both Taiwan and China's bids to join, I was really interested in how do you see Japanese and US support for Taiwan's inclusion into CPTPP as a priority? Should it be prioritized by the United States and Japan? And if so, what can the United States and Japan be doing to press for Taiwan's ascension to CPTPP, barring the fact that the US is not party to the agreement currently? I feel like China's going to be doing a lot to ensure that behind the scenes, other members that are party to the agreement are going to be voting against Taiwan's ascension. So should there be a dual effort from the United States and Japan to try and push back against that? Thank you.
Thank you, Jada, for that question. Well, because the U.S. is out, I don't think that it can say much regarding Taiwan and the CPTPP. It can send signals of encouragement, but the United States could do something far more meaningful under its direct control, and that is to decide to negotiate a trade agreement with Taiwan. And this has been discussed at length, but there hasn't been much movement there. We have to take into account that we have two things. The Trump administration really elevated the strategic significance of Taiwan, but there was no economic follow-up to that. So the trade agenda made no progress. Now with the Biden administration, again, there is a strong support for Taiwan, but we're in a context in which the Biden administration is not really thinking about new, meaningful trade negotiations. And that, of course, applies to Taiwan. But if the United States really wanted to do something, I think that would be very meaningful. And from the point of view of Japan, Japan is CPTPP chair this year. And then next year, I think it's Singapore. So there's still a few months where I think that Japan can work with others, and both countries, member economies who want to join have to, show proof of how close they are to the standard. So that's the next step. And then the members will decide whether to initiate a working group for negotiations or no. I think that at this moment, making sure that the fact that Taiwan is closer to meeting those standards is a good message to send. But there is, of course, the realization that it's by consensus. So, it only takes one for this not to go forward. So I think that we probably going to be with this for quite a long stretch of time.
Well, we've covered an extraordinary range of issues, Mireya, and we're coming very close to our appointed hour. I just have to say, in conclusion, you've shown us a tremendous versatility. You've shown us a new normal, which seems disturbingly. I mean, there are conflict dimensions. There's an increasing securitization of economic affairs that could lead to deepening conflict. And of course, we have sectors where the civilian and the military, like 5G and artificial intelligence, those sectors are beginning to merge, which provides some shadows on the horizon. Something new that I take out of this is the proactive dimensions of Japanese policy. I mean, even calling it economic statecraft suggests that there's something more to it. This is not simply a matter of responding to outside pressures in some random, non-systematic way. There is more strategy. There's a changing bureaucracy. There's maybe more proactive private sectors in some ways. We're into a bit of a different world. It sounds like, listening to you. Those are just reactions. I don't know. Do you have any final comments.
No, thank you, Kent. I think you summarized some of the gist of these developments. And my only final comment would be that, you know, we're moving to a world of, a colleague of mine calls it floating multilateralism, different coalitions, plug and play. So we used to think about, you know, the Bretton Woods institutions, much more structured, or the alliance network. And it seems that now we're finding these different flexible groupings. And I think that that, you know, is another element that we should be keeping in our radar.
Well, you told us that the world is big. It might be that we're all resolute in pursuit of particular goals, but the world is big, and somehow we have to remember that as well. Really, you've provoked so many ideas, and we look forward to the next chance to hear from you. Thank you very much, Mireya. And thank you also to our audience today for everything. It's been a very interesting discussion.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Thank you.